Get comfortable. Let the day you have been carrying slide off your shoulders. Let your breathing slow and lengthen, and let the world narrow down to just this quiet voice and the soft dark around you. Tonight we are going a very long way back, further than we usually travel, past the gaslight and the crinolines and the railways, into a colder and stranger England, where the year is 1545, and a king named Henry sits on the throne in the last years of his reign. We are going into a great stone house in the English countryside, and we are going to spend a long, unhurried day there, from the first grey light to the last candle, in the company of the woman who runs it. You are that woman. You are a Tudor noblewoman, somewhere in your 30s, the lady of a considerable house and estate, married to a man of standing, mother to several children, mistress of a household that numbers not a handful of servants, but dozens of people, and today, like every day, the whole of it is yours to manage. That is who you are tonight. Not a queen, not a figure from the history books, but the kind of woman there were hundreds of in Tudor England, running the great houses of the shires while the men were away at court, or at law, or at war. Now, before we begin, let us set down the picture you probably have, because it is almost entirely wrong, and correcting it is the whole point of tonight. When you imagine a Tudor noblewoman, I suspect you see something like a portrait come to life, a pale, still figure in stiff embroidered velvet, hands folded, jewels at her throat, standing decoratively in a panelled room, doing nothing very much at all. Perhaps you imagine her embroidering by a window, or being courted, or waiting for her husband to come home and tell her what has happened in the world. The portraits encourage this, because a portrait shows a woman standing still in her best clothes, and that is all it can show. And so we have inherited an image of these women as ornamental, idle, decorative, the passive furniture of a man's household. That picture is almost the reverse of what she actually was. The Tudor noblewoman was, in the plainest terms, the working manager of a large and complex institution. Her house was not a home in our sense. It was an enterprise, with a population, an economy, a supply chain, and a daily output, and she ran it. She commanded the staff. She controlled the stores. She kept the accounts. She was, and this is the part that most surprises people, the physician and apothecary to her entire household, and often to the wider estate as well, mixing medicines with her own hands from herbs she had grown and distilled herself, treating the sick, dressing wounds, delivering remedies, because there was no doctor for miles, and she was what stood between her people and their illnesses. She educated the children in her care, including the daughters of other noble families sent to her to be trained, and when her husband was away, which was often and sometimes for months or years, she did not simply wait. She took his place. She ran the estate, collected the rents, settled the disputes, defended the family's interests in law and in business, and answered for all of it. And here is the thing to hold against all of that competence, the thing that makes her story worth telling rather than merely admiring. In the law of her own country, she barely existed. Under the doctrine that governed married women, her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's the moment she married. She could not, in the ordinary way, own property in her own right, or make a contract in her own name, or go to law as herself. She might command 60 people and manage an estate worth a fortune and hold the lives of a whole household in her competent hands, and still, on paper, she was not a person who could sign for any of it. That is the shape of the day we are about to live. Enormous real authority, no legal standing whatsoever, both true at once, every hour of every day, and she carried both, without apparently finding it strange, because it was simply the water she swam in. So if you would like more nights like this one, quiet journeys into vanished worlds, you might subscribe, and you might leave a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight and what hour it is where you are, because I am always struck by the thought of this voice going out into so many different darknesses at once, and there is nothing you need to remember or hold on to as we go. Let it wash over you. If your attention drifts, let it drift. If you fall asleep before the household has even had its breakfast, which is entirely the point, the day will go on turning without you. So let go, and let the words carry you back, 500 years, into a cold stone chamber at first light and the beginning of your day. It is early, and it is dark, and it is cold, in a way that is hard for us to imagine now, because this is a stone house in an English winter, and there is no heat in it except fire, and the fires have been out all night. You wake in a great curtained bed, and the curtains are not decoration but insulation, heavy hangings drawn close around the bed to hold in the warmth of the bodies inside it through the long freezing night. Beyond those curtains the room is bitter. Your breath will show in the air, and somewhere in the house, already, people are moving, because the household wakes before its lady does, and by the time you rise, the fires will be lit, and the water heated, and the day's machinery set, turning by hands that rose in the dark to turn it. You lie for a moment in the warm dark of the bed, listening to the house wake around you, and then the curtains are drawn back, and the cold comes in, and the day begins. You do not dress yourself. That is the first thing to understand about a Tudor noblewoman's morning, and it is not laziness, but simple physical necessity, because the clothes of a woman of your rank could not be put on by one pair of hands. So the women who attend you come in, and the long business of dressing begins, and it will take a considerable part of your morning. Consider who these women are, because they are not servants in the way we might assume. A noblewoman of standing was attended by gentlewomen, women of good family themselves, sometimes the daughters of neighboring gentry, sent to your household to be trained and finished and placed. They were companions and attendants at once, of a rank far above the ordinary household servants, and their service to you was not menial labor, but something closer to an apprenticeship in how to be a lady of a great house. They dressed you, kept you company, sewed with you, walked with you, and learned by watching you run your household how they would one day run their own. To have such women about you was a mark of your standing. To be one was a stage in a young gentlewoman's education, and so your morning dressing was a social occasion of a kind, conducted in company, with talk and news, and the small business of the day beginning even as the layers went on. And there were many layers. Let us go through them, slowly, because the clothing of a Tudor noblewoman is one of the best windows into her world that we have. Against your skin goes the smock, a simple garment of fine linen, and here is a point worth pausing on, because it overturns another lazy assumption about this period. Tudor people of your rank were fastidious about clean linen. It was a matter of real pride to have fresh linen every day, and a person of high rank would own enough changes of it to last well beyond a week. The smock was washable, and it was washed, and it was changed, and it sat between your body and the enormously expensive outer garments, precisely so that those outer garments, which could not easily be cleaned, need never touch your skin. Cleanliness, in this age, was not about immersing the body in water, which was thought unhealthy, and was in any case a great labor. It was about linen. Clean linen next to the skin, changed often, was how a Tudor gentlewoman was clean, and by the standards of her own time, she was scrupulous about it. Over the smock goes the petticoat, a skirt for warmth and for shape. Then, if you are following the newest fashion coming in from Spain, the farthingale, which is a structured underskirt of hoops made of rope or reed or whalebone, worn at the waist to hold your skirts out in the stiff cone shape that is just now becoming the height of style. The farthingale is a recent arrival in England, only beginning to be widely adopted in these very years, and to wear one is to be fashionable and modern. It is also, it must be said, an awkward machine to move about in, and it makes doorways and chairs and stairs into small daily problems that a woman of fashion simply learns to manage. Over that goes the kirtle, a fitted garment, supporting the body and shaping the torso, its bodice stiffened with buckram or similar, though not laced brutally tight in the way later centuries would come to demand. The Tudor silhouette is flat and straight and rigid rather than pinched. And then, over all of it, the gown, the outermost and most expensive layer of silk or satin or velvet, often furred, often embroidered, cut to display the finer garments beneath through its openings, and the sleeves may be separate items, pinned or tied on. And there is the forepart, an embroidered triangle of rich fabric that shows through the front opening of the gown, and the partlet, a fine, sometimes almost transparent garment filling in the neckline, and stockings of knitted wool, or, if you can afford it, of silk, held up by garters, because there is no elastic in the world, and shoes, soft leather or velvet for indoors, and at the last, the headdress, which for a woman of your rank and this decade might be the French hood, a curved and jeweled arc set back on the head, or an older gable hood if your taste runs conservative. Count the layers, and you find at minimum 4, and in practice, dressed for anything of consequence, considerably more, all of it pinned and laced and tied into place by other people's hands. This is why you cannot dress yourself. It is also why the dressing takes so long, and why it is done in company, and why the clothes themselves are so extraordinarily valuable. A gown of good velvet, furred and embroidered, represented a sum of money that would have kept a laboring family for a very long time indeed. Clothing at this level was not fashion in our disposable sense. It was capital. It was wealth you wore. Gowns were listed in wills and left to daughters. They were altered and retrimmed and passed on and worn for years, because the fabric alone was too precious to discard. When you put on your gown this morning, you are putting on a substantial portion of your family's movable wealth, and everyone who sees you today will read it exactly that way, which is precisely what it is for. And there is one more thing your clothes are doing, and it is worth naming plainly. They are announcing your rank, and they are doing so under the force of law. Tudor England had statutes governing who might wear what, sumptuary laws that reserved certain fabrics, certain furs, certain colors for certain ranks. Cloth of gold and purple silk were for the highest. Sables were restricted. The intent was to keep the visible order of society legible, so that a person's rank could be read at a glance, and no rich merchant could dress himself up as a lord. Whether these laws were rigorously enforced is another question, and mostly they were not, but they existed, and they express something real about this world, which is that appearance was not personal expression, but public information. Your gown tells anyone who sees it exactly where you stand. It is a uniform, in its way, as much as anything a soldier wears. And then the jewels, which are the last layer, and in some ways, the most consequential. A woman of your rank wears them, and they are not trinkets. Gold chains, worn long and doubled, a jeweled pendant at the breast, rings, several of them, sometimes many, a girdle at the waist, itself often of goldsmith's work, from which might hang a pomander, a small perforated sphere holding scented substances, carried against bad air and unpleasant smells, and, it was believed, against disease. A book of hours might hang there too, bound small and jeweled, both a devotional object and an ornament. Jewels in this century were wealth in its most portable and most pledgeable form. They were bought as investment, given as gifts of enormous significance, listed meticulously in inventories, left specifically in wills, and pawned in emergencies, and many a family raised money at short notice against the mistress's jewels. What you clasp round your neck this morning may well be the most liquid asset the family owns, and it is being worn, visibly, on a woman who cannot legally own it, which is one more instance of the arrangement we keep meeting. She carries the wealth and does not hold it. Dressed at last, laced and pinned and hooded and jeweled, you are ready to begin the day. And a Tudor day begins, always and without exception, in the same place. Not with breakfast, not with business, but on your knees. Prayer comes first, and it comes first every day. And if you want to understand how differently a Tudor person experienced time from the way we do, this is where to begin. The day was not divided by the clock in the way ours is. It was divided by devotion. The old monastic hours, the pattern of prayer at fixed points through the day and night that had shaped English life for centuries, still structured the rhythm of a great household, even for those who never entered a monastery. You rose and you prayed. You prayed again at mid-morning. You prayed before meals and after them. You prayed in the evening, and the whole household gathered to do it. The day was a frame of prayer, with activity fitted into the spaces between, rather than a day of activity with prayer squeezed in. So in the morning, you go to your prayers, in the household chapel, if the house has one, which a house of this size very likely does, or in your own closet, the small private room where a person of rank kept their books of devotion. You have a primer, a book of hours, very likely a beautiful one, illuminated, perhaps inherited, perhaps given at your marriage, and it is among your most treasured possessions and one of the few things in this house that is genuinely and personally yours. You kneel and you pray, and the household prays, and only then does the day's business begin. Now we should be honest about the moment we have chosen, because the year 1545 is a delicate one to be praying in England. This is the middle of a religious upheaval that has torn through the country within your own adult memory. The king broke with Rome a little over a decade ago. The monasteries, which had stood for centuries, which had been landmarks and landlords and hospitals and schools across the whole country, were dissolved within the last 10 years. Their buildings stripped, their communities scattered, their lands sold off, and many of them bought up by families exactly like yours. The forms of worship have been altered, old certainties have been questioned, and questioned back again, and to hold the wrong opinion too loudly has become genuinely dangerous. What does this mean for you, kneeling at your prayers this morning? It means you live in a country where the most fundamental question a person could ask, the question of how one should approach God, has become unstable and politically charged within your lifetime. Your grandmother's faith and your daughter's faith may not be the same thing. The prayers you learned as a child may have been quietly revised, and the safest course for a family of standing is a careful, moderate, unspoken conformity, doing what is currently required, keeping one's deeper opinions within the household, and above all, not drawing attention. There is a whole texture of Tudor life in this, a wariness, a habit of discretion about the innermost things, that we who have never had to watch our words about our beliefs may find hard to feel from the inside. You pray this morning in the manner currently approved. What you think while you pray is your own, and you keep it so. And your religious duty is not only private, because a lady of a great house had a public devotional role as well. The household is a spiritual unit, and you are responsible for its soul as well as its stomach. It is your business that the household attends prayers, that the servants are instructed in the faith, that the children are catechized, that the chaplain is supported, and the chapel maintained. There is a phrase used in this period for the mistress of a household, that she is to be a good and godly governor of her family. And family here means not merely your blood relations, but every soul under your roof, servants included. Their moral and religious welfare is charged to you. If they are ignorant of their prayers, that is your failure. If they fall into bad conduct, that is your failure too. You are, in a sense, the spiritual as well as the practical head of a small community, and it is one more department of a very large job. Picture the household at its prayers, because it is a scene worth seeing. 60 people assembled, in the chapel if it will hold them, or in the great hall if it will not, arranged by rank as they are arranged for everything, the family at the front, and the household ranged behind in its careful order. The chaplain leads. The responses come back in 60 voices, most of them knowing the words by heart because they have said them every day of their lives. And then it is over, and the whole assembly disperses to its work, and the house begins to hum. There is something in the daily repetition of it, this gathering of an entire community twice a day to say the same words together, that bound a household into a single body in a way we have no real equivalent for. It was not merely religious observance, it was the thing that made 60 unrelated people into a family. Beyond prayer, there is charity, and this too is a formal duty rather than a private impulse. A great house was expected to relieve the poor of its neighborhood, and that expectation fell squarely on the lady. There were people at your gate, regularly, and there was a system for dealing with them. Broken meat, the leftovers of the household's meals, was given out at the gate to the poor, and in a house that fed 60 people daily, this was not a trivial quantity of food. There were alms given, doles distributed on particular days, help sent to the sick and the aged of the parish, and you decided, or supervised, the deciding of who received what. This was not sentimental charity. It was a recognized social obligation attached to your rank, the return the great made for their position, and a household known to be ungenerous at the gate suffered in reputation for it. So the poor of the parish were, in a real sense, part of your responsibility, another population dependent on the house you managed, and their relief was administered by you. The prayers are done. The household is fed spiritually, or at least assembled and instructed. And now, with the morning properly begun, you turn to the work of the day, which is the running of the enterprise, and the first business of that is to find out what has happened overnight, what is needed, what has gone wrong, and what must be decided. Your officers are waiting, so let us go and meet them and see the machine you actually command. Let us stop the day for a while and look properly at the thing you are running, because unless you grasp the scale of a Tudor great household, nothing else about your life makes sense. This is not a home with some servants in it. This is an institution, and by the standards of its own time, a large one, and the word contemporaries used for it says everything. They called it a family. Not family in our narrow blood sense, but family meaning the whole body of people who lived under your roof and owed you service and were owed your protection in return. Your children were part of your family. So were 60 other people, most of them unrelated to you by blood, and all of them your responsibility. 60 is not an exaggeration for a house of this standing, and great households could run far larger, into the hundreds at the very top of the scale. And the striking thing to modern eyes is that most of these people were men. The Tudor great household was overwhelmingly male in its staffing, quite unlike the Victorian house with its armies of maids. There were grooms and yeomen, and pages and clerks and cooks and porters and stablemen, and only a relatively small number of women, chiefly the gentlewomen who attended you, and a few in the laundry and dairy. You, as lady of the house, commanded a largely male establishment, and the fact that this raised no eyebrows at all tells you something useful about where a noblewoman's authority actually sat. Her rank outranked their sex. A yeoman of the chamber took orders from the lady of the house because she was the lady of the house, and that was simply the order of things. The household was organized into departments, each with its own officer, and these officers were the senior men through whom you and your husband governed the whole. There was the steward, the most senior of all, who oversaw the estate and its business and presided over the hall. There was the chamberlain, responsible for the private chambers and the family's personal service. There was the cofferer, or the clerk of the kitchen, keeping the accounts and the reckonings. There were the officers of the specific departments, the pantry, the buttery which handled the drink, the kitchen, the stables. Each department had its staff and its stores and its accounts, and each officer answered upward, and at the top of that structure sat you and your husband, or, when your husband was away, you alone. Think about what this meant as a daily task. Every morning, there were reckonings to be gone over, because a household of this size consumed a startling quantity of food and drink and fuel and light every single day, and all of it had to be accounted for. There were decisions to be made about supply, about what must be bought, and what the estate itself would provide. There were disputes among the staff to be settled, because 60 people living together generate friction as reliably as any other crowd. There were the day's meals to be settled, and the day's work to be assigned. There were letters, which we will come to, because letters were the arteries of a family's business, and much of the writing of them was a woman's work. This was, in plain terms, a management job, and a demanding one, and the woman who did it badly would find the household in disorder, and the family's money leaking away, and the reputation of the house suffering, all of which would be, correctly, laid at her door. And now let us hold up the two things that make this life so strange to us, and set them side by side, because they are the heart of tonight. Here is the first. You have real authority. It is not decorative or symbolic. You give orders to grown men, and they obey. You control stores worth a great deal of money. You decide who eats what, and who is relieved at the gate, and who is dismissed for drunkenness. When your husband is at court, or at law in London, or away with the King's army in France, which in this decade is a real and frequent possibility, you run the entire estate in his place, and everyone from the steward to the poorest tenant deals with you as the authority. There are letters surviving from this century, real ones, from wives to absent husbands, and they are full of business, of rents and lawsuits and repairs and disputes with neighbors, written by women who are plainly and competently running large concerns and reporting on them. And here is the second. In the law of England, as a married woman, you are what the lawyers call a femme covert, a covered woman, your legal identity subsumed into your husband's. You cannot, in the ordinary course, own property in your own right. You cannot make a binding contract in your own name. You cannot sue or be sued as yourself. The money you brought to the marriage became his. The household you command is his household. The estate you run in his absence is his estate. You act, always, as his deputy, exercising his authority by his leave, and if he chose to overrule you in anything, he could, and the law would be entirely on his side. Both of those are true at the same time, every day, and it is worth sitting with how odd that is. You wield genuine power, and you own none of it. You manage a fortune and cannot sign for a penny of it. Your competence is real, tested, daily, and visible to everyone, and your legal standing is nothing at all. The Tudors saw no contradiction here, because to them the household was a small kingdom, and the wife was its queen, and the husband its king, and a queen governs really, but not sovereignly. That was the theory, tidy and complete. In practice, it meant that hundreds of extremely capable women spent their whole adult lives running substantial enterprises on borrowed authority, and that if a woman were unlucky in her husband, all her competence would not save her from him. There is one exception worth naming because it mattered enormously, and it is widowhood. A widow was not a femme covert. She recovered her legal personhood. She could own, contract, sue, and act in her own name, and she was entitled to her dower, her portion of the estate for her lifetime's support. A wealthy widow was therefore one of the freest people in Tudor England. A woman with means and legal capacity and no husband to answer to, and many of them, having tasted that, declined to marry again. It is a strange and rather bleak arrangement that a woman's fullest legal freedom in this society arrived only through her husband's death, but there it is, and the women of the age understood it perfectly well. That is the machine then, and your place in it. Now let us go back into the day, because your officers have been waiting patiently through all this explanation, and the morning's business will not settle itself. Let us walk the house for a while, because the building you live in is unlike any home you have ever entered, and its architecture explains a great deal about how life inside it was actually conducted. Begin with the great hall, the largest room and the ancient heart of the house, high-ceilinged, often open to the roof timbers, with its dais at one end. In an older tradition, the hall was where nearly everything happened, where the whole household ate and much of it slept, a single vast communal space. By your century, that has been changing, and changing fast. The family has been withdrawing from the hall into private rooms beyond it, and this withdrawal is one of the great slow revolutions of English domestic life. Behind the dais end of the hall, up a stair, lies the great chamber, the second most important room in the house, and this is where the family increasingly lives, receives, and sometimes dines. Beyond the great chamber may lie further rooms, more private still, the parlor, the bedchamber, the closet. That word closet deserves a moment, because it is not a cupboard. A closet in a Tudor house is a small private room, and it is very nearly the only genuinely private space a person of your rank possesses. It is where you keep your books, your devotional primer, your papers, perhaps your jewels and your writing things. It is where you go to pray alone, or to read, or to write a letter you would rather not write in company. In a house of 60 people, where you are almost never physically alone, the closet is the one door you can close. Privacy, in this world, is a scarce and precious commodity, and the closet is the architecture of the small amount of it you are permitted, because you are, in truth, almost never alone. This is one of the hardest things for a modern person to feel from the inside. Your gentlewomen attend you through the day, servants come and go. Even sleeping arrangements were not private in our sense, with attendants sometimes sleeping in or near their master's or mistress's chamber, on truckle beds or pallets, so that someone was always within call. The idea that a person should have hours of solitude as a matter of course would have struck a Tudor household as bizarre and rather sad. Company was the normal state of human life. Solitude was for prayer, or for melancholy, or for something suspicious. Now look at the fabric of the rooms themselves. The walls are hung with tapestries or painted cloths, and these are not decoration alone, but insulation, because stone walls are cold and hangings hold warmth. A good set of tapestries was among the most valuable movable possessions a family owned, worth more than most furniture, listed in inventories, carried from house to house when the family moved. Wall hangings were wealth on display and warmth at the same time, which is an efficient arrangement. The furniture is sparse by our standards, and heavy, oak mostly, joined stools and benches and chests. Chairs, plural, are rarer than you would think. In many houses there was one proper chair for the master or the most honored guest, and everyone else sat on stools or benches, which is where the word chairman comes from and why sitting in the chair meant something. Chests do the work that wardrobes and cupboards do for us, storing everything and doubling as seats and tables. The great bed, with its curtains, is the single most valuable piece of furniture in the house, and is treated with corresponding respect, sometimes bequeathed by name in wills. The windows are glazed, which in a house of this standing is expected, though glass remains expensive enough that in some houses it was treated as a removable fitting rather than part of the building. Windows are small by our standards, because glass costs and heat escapes. The rooms are therefore dimmer than we would like, even in daylight, and much darker in winter. The floors of the hall and the lesser rooms are strewn with rushes, and here we should be honest, because it is a genuinely unpleasant detail. Rushes were laid on floors and swept out and replaced periodically, and in a well-run house, that happened often, and sweet herbs were strewn among them to freshen the air. In a badly run house, it happened rarely, and what accumulated in old rushes does not bear detailed description. A visiting Dutch scholar wrote a famous and disgusted account of English floor rushes, and it has been quoted ever since. The reputation of the whole century for filth rests partly on that one letter. The truth is that standards varied enormously from house to house, exactly as they do now, and that the difference between a well-kept house and a squalid one was, in large part, the competence of the woman running it. Your floors are swept and strewn fresh and scented with herbs because you see to it. Heating is fireplaces, and this is another quiet revolution in progress during your century. The old arrangement was a central hearth in the hall, with the smoke finding its way out through a louvre in the roof, which meant smoky halls and blackened timbers. Chimneys and wall fireplaces spread widely through the 16th century, transforming domestic life making it possible to heat separate rooms and therefore to live in them, which is precisely what made the family's withdrawal from the great hall practical. Chimneys built the private room. A commentator later in the century remarked on how many chimneys had gone up within living memory, and he was noticing something real. And washing, since we have raised the subject of cleanliness. There is no plumbing. Water is carried from a well or a conduit by servants in buckets and heated over a fire if it is wanted warm. Personal washing is done from a basin, hands and face daily, the whole body rarely, and cleanliness is achieved, as we said, chiefly through the frequent changing of linen. Sanitation is the privy or the close stool, and the emptying of these is somebody's job, and that somebody is very near the bottom of the household. The whole apparatus of daily bodily life that we accomplish with taps and drains is here accomplished by human labor, carrying things in and carrying things out, all day, every day, unremarked. That is the house, cold, dim, crowded, hung with expensive cloth, warmed by fires that someone must feed, lit by flames that someone must tend, and populated at every hour by people. It is a machine for living in, and you are its engineer. Now we come to the room that, more than any other, shows you what a Tudor noblewoman actually was, and it is a room that will surprise you, because it is neither a parlor nor a bedchamber, but something closer to a laboratory. It is called the stillroom, and it is yours. The stillroom takes its name from the still, the distilling apparatus, and that tells you at once that this is a place of manufacture rather than leisure. Here, in a room set aside for the purpose, the lady of a Tudor house made things. She distilled waters from herbs and flowers. She compounded medicines. She made preserves and conserves and cordials and syrups. She dried and stored the herbs from her own garden. She produced sweet waters and scented things for the household, and candles, and polishes, and soaps. The still room was part apothecary's shop, part chemist's bench, part perfumery, part preserving kitchen, and in the Tudor period, crucially, the lady of the house ran it herself, with her own hands, assisted by her gentlewomen and her daughters, whom she was training in the same skills, so that they could do it in their own houses one day. Hold on to that last point, because it is a detail that later centuries would erase. In the Victorian house, 400 years on, the still room would still exist, but it would be worked by a still room maid, a junior servant, under the housekeeper. The skill would have traveled all the way down the social ladder until it was menial. But here, in 1545, it is at the top. It is the lady's own province, a mark of her accomplishment, and a woman who was known for her physic and her preserves was admired for it in exactly the way we might admire professional expertise. Her recipe book, her collection of receipts as they called them, gathered over years, added to from friends and relations, and passed down to her daughters, was a genuinely valuable possession, a body of working knowledge in manuscript. Many such books survive. They are, in effect, the working notebooks of unlicensed female practitioners. Because that is what you are. Let us be plain about it. In your house and on your estate, you are the doctor. There is no other. Physicians existed in Tudor England, but they were few, expensive, concentrated in the towns, and largely the resource of the very rich in a crisis. Surgeons and barber surgeons handled the cutting and the setting of bones. Apothecaries in the towns sold compounded drugs, but for the daily reality of sickness in a rural great household, 60 people falling ill and getting hurt in all the ordinary ways that people do. The person who treats them is the lady of the house, using medicines she has made herself, according to knowledge she has gathered herself, on her own judgment. So your mourning in the still room is real work with real stakes. Someone in the household has a fever, and you will decide what to give them. A stable boy has a wound that is not healing, and you will dress it. There is a persistent cough going round the servants' quarters, and you will make up a syrup for it. A tenant's wife on the estate has sent up to the house asking for something for her child, and you will provide it, because the great house is where medicine comes from for miles around. Your herb garden supplies the raw material, and you know those plants intimately, what rosemary and sage and bay and plantain and lavender are for, in what preparation, at what strength, for which complaint. This is knowledge you were taught as a girl, in your mother's still room, or in the household where you were placed to be trained, and you have added to it every year since. Now, the medicine itself, judged by what we now know, was a mixture. Some of it was genuinely effective, and more of it than we tend to assume. Many of the herbs in a Tudor still room have real pharmacological properties, and centuries of accumulated practical observation had worked out a good deal about what actually help. Wound dressings using honey, for instance, which we now know to be genuinely antibacterial, were standard practice. Willow, containing the compound that would eventually give us aspirin, was known for pain. A great deal of the herbal materia medica was sound, and some of it was useless, and some of it rested on theories of the body, the balance of humors, and the influence of the planets that were wholly mistaken. The lady in her still room could not tell which was which, because nobody could, and she worked with the best knowledge her age possessed, applied carefully, and observed closely. That is all that anyone in any age can do. But here is what I want you to take from the still room, and it is the thesis of this whole video in miniature. This was skilled, technical, consequential work, performed by women at the highest social level, and it was invisible as work because it happened inside the household. A man who compounded medicines and treated the sick for money in a town was a practitioner with a recognized place in the world. A woman who did precisely the same thing for 60 people inside her own house was simply being a good housewife. The same knowledge, the same skill, the same results, and one is a profession and the other is a wife's duty. The category of housewifery swallowed an enormous amount of genuine expertise and made it disappear, and the still room is where you can see that happening most clearly, because it is a working laboratory that history filed under domestic accomplishment. You finish in the still room with your hands smelling of herbs and your morning's medicines set aside to steep or settle or cool. The household's sick are attended to. The stores of remedies are replenished against the next need. And you go out into the rest of the morning, because the still room is only one department of a very large concern, and there is a great deal else waiting. The children, for one thing, and their education, which is another of your responsibilities, and another place where a Tudor noblewoman's life will surprise you. We have talked a great deal about the household as a machine, and it is time to look at the people inside it, because 60 individuals lived under your roof, and their lives were shaped entirely by your judgment. Servant in this century does not mean what it came to mean later. The Tudor household servant was not necessarily poor and was very often not lowly. The upper servants of a great house were men of standing, gentlemen sometimes, who served because service in a great household was a respectable career and a route to advancement. A steward might be a man of education managing substantial property. The gentleman and yeoman of the household came from families of some substance. Serving a great lord was not a humiliation, but a position, and men competed for these places and held them with pride. And then, descending, there were the ordinary servants, the grooms and the labourers, and the kitchen staff, and the boys who did the fetching, and at the bottom, the people who did the work nobody wanted, the scouring and the carrying and the emptying. Their lives were harder, and their prospects thinner, but even they were, in the theory of the household, part of the family, entitled to be fed and housed and clothed, and, when they were sick, treated, which is precisely why your stillroom mattered. The terms of service were mostly annual. A servant was hired for a year, often at one of the quarter days, and at the end of the year could leave or be kept on, and this annual hiring fare rhythm meant a household's composition shifted regularly, and that a reputation as a good house or a bad one mattered enormously for the quality of people you could attract. Wages were low and were only part of the compensation. The real substance of a servant's payment was board and lodging, food and a bed, and often clothing, sometimes livery in the family's colours, which was itself a mark of belonging to a great house and carried its own pride. Your relationship with these people was, in the language of the age, governance. You were expected to govern them, which meant not merely directing their work, but overseeing their conduct, their morals, their religious observance, their quarrels, and their welfare. A disorderly household reflected on its governors, so you dealt with drunkenness, with theft, with idleness, with the friction between people forced to live at close quarters, and you dealt with it with real authority, including the authority to dismiss, which for a servant meant losing home and livelihood at once. And there was genuine reciprocity in it, at least in principle. In exchange for service and obedience, the household owed protection and provision. A servant who fell ill was cared for. An old servant who had given decades might be kept on in some light capacity or remembered in a will, and Tudor wills are full of small bequests to named servants, sums of money, garments, sometimes touching little legacies that suggest real attachment. The relationship could be warm. People who live together for 20 years generally arrive somewhere, and the surviving evidence shows masters and servants who were fond of each other, trusted each other, and mourned each other. But let us not sentimentalize it, because the reciprocity was entirely asymmetric. The affection was real, and the power was absolute, and all of it ran one way. You could dismiss a servant, and a servant could not dismiss you. Your good opinion determined their prospects, their reputation, their ability to find another place. If you were kind, their lives were bearable. If you were harsh, they had almost no recourse. And the whole arrangement rested on the unquestioned assumption that some people were born to command and others to serve, an assumption that everyone in the house shared, including the servants, because it was the only account of the world available. There is a particular thing worth noticing here, and it connects back to everything else tonight. You, as a woman, held real authority over grown men in your household, and this was unremarkable, and yet you held no authority whatsoever over your own husband, or over the law, or over your own property, and that was equally unremarkable. Rank cut across sex, so that a noblewoman outranked a yeoman, regardless of his being male, while sex cut across rank, so that the same noblewoman was subordinate to her husband, regardless of her competence. The two hierarchies crossed each other, and a person's position was determined by where they stood in both. It was not a simple pyramid. It was a lattice, and everybody in the house understood their exact place in it and moved through the day in accordance with a set of rules nobody had written down and nobody needed to. That is the human texture of the household you have been running all day. Not staff in the modern employment sense, and not slaves, but a community of dependents bound to you by a web of obligation running in both directions, whose lives you shaped daily, and who shaped yours more than the records will ever show, because it was their labor that produced every comfortable moment of the day we have just lived. The children are your business too, and Tudor child-rearing among the nobility runs on principles so different from ours that it repays a careful look. Start with the arithmetic of it, because it shapes everything else. You have borne several children. You may well bear more, because childbearing continued through a married woman's fertile years with little to interrupt it. And you have very likely lost some. Infant and child mortality in this century was high enough that a woman of your rank could expect, statistically, to bury children, and most women did. This is a fact of Tudor life so universal that it structured how people thought about children altogether, and it is worth handling gently, because it is the sorrow underlying every nursery in this age. Parents loved their children exactly as fiercely as parents do now, and the letters and the tomb inscriptions and the grieving poems of this period make that unmistakable. And they also lived with a probability of loss that we, mercifully, do not, and they built their expectations around it. Both things were true, and neither cancels the other. The children who live are not raised by you directly, not in the hands-on daily sense. They have nurses when small, and then tutors, and they occupy their own part of the household with their own attendants. Your role is directive rather than practical. You decide, or share the deciding, on their education, their discipline, their religious instruction, their futures. You see them daily, but you do not spend your day with them, because you have 60 people to run, and they have people appointed to them. And then, at somewhere around 7 to 14 years old, something happens that would strike a modern parent as extraordinary. Your children leave, not all at once and not permanently, but the Tudor nobility practiced what historians call placing out, the sending of children away from home to be raised and educated in another great household. Your sons will go to serve in the household of a greater family, a lord or a courtier, where they will be trained as pages and gentlemen, learn to carve and to serve at table and to bear themselves, and, crucially, form the connections that will make their careers. Your daughters may go too, into the household of a great lady, to be trained in exactly the skills you are practicing today. The management of a house, the still room, the needle, the accomplishments, and the bearing of a gentlewoman. And in return, other people's children come to you. The gentlewomen attending you this morning may well be the daughters of neighboring families placed in your care. There may be boys in the household serving as pages, sons of your husband's connections. So the great houses of Tudor England swapped their children with each other in a great slow circulation, each family's offspring being raised partly by other families, and this seemed to everyone perfectly natural and indeed desirable. Foreign visitors remarked on it, sometimes disapprovingly, wondering whether the English lacked natural affection for their own young. The English answer, more or less, was that a child, raised entirely at home, would be spoiled and would learn nothing, whereas a child placed in another house would learn manners, deference, useful skills, and, most importantly, would build a network, because that was the real function of it, underneath the education. Placing out was how the Tudor elite wove itself together. A boy who served as page in a great lord's household had a patron for life. A girl trained in a great lady's household had connections, a reputation, and a much better chance of a good marriage. The children were, in a sense, being invested, sent out to accumulate social capital and bring it home, and the receiving household gained in turn, because a great house full of other families' children was a house with many families obliged to it. It was an exchange, and everybody understood the terms. For you, as a mother, it means your children will grow up substantially elsewhere, and you will manage them by letter. And for you, as mistress of the house, it means you are responsible for other people's children, as well as your own, charged with their training and their conduct, and answerable to their parents for how they turn out. The young gentlewomen in your care are your pupils. What they learn from you is what you are doing all day, every day, and they learn it by watching you do it. You are, among your other roles, running a small finishing school for the daughters of your county. There is one more thing to say about the education of daughters in this particular century, because it is genuinely remarkable, and it belongs to your lifetime specifically. This is the moment when serious classical education for high-born women became briefly, brilliantly fashionable in England. The humanist scholars of the age argued that women were capable of real learning, and a fashion took hold among the highest families for giving daughters an education in Latin and Greek and rhetoric that would have been unthinkable a century earlier and would fade again a century later. Thomas More educated his daughters famously well. The daughters of the royal family were formidably schooled, and one of them, the king's younger daughter, is at this very moment a girl being given one of the finest educations in Europe, and will one day be the most learned monarch of her age. Among your own class, a girl might learn languages, read the classics, write verse, and be praised for it. Whether your own daughters get such an education depends on you and on your husband and on the fashion in your county. But it was possible, in this decade, in a way it had not been before, and a mother who wanted her daughters taught could find teachers and find approval for it. It did not last. The window narrowed again as the century turned. But for a few decades, in the households of the English elite, it was genuinely open, and some remarkable women came through it. The children are seen to, then, their lessons set, their conduct reviewed, their letters written. The morning is well advanced, and the household is beginning to turn toward the first great communal event of its day, which in a Tudor house comes far earlier than you would expect, because dinner is at 11. We should look, before the day closes, at how you came to be here at all, because your marriage is the foundation of everything we have watched today, and it was arranged for you before you had much say in the matter. Marriage among the Tudor nobility was a transaction between families concerning land, money, blood, and alliance, and everyone involved understood it that way and said so openly. It was not that people did not believe in affection. They did, and they hoped for it, and the literature of the age is full of love. But the hoping came second. The match was made on the basis of what it joined, and the two young people at its center were the instruments of the joining rather than its authors. So a marriage was negotiated. The families discussed it, sometimes through intermediaries, sometimes over a considerable period. There was a dowry or marriage portion brought by the bride's family, money or land, and the size of it was a matter of hard bargaining because it determined how good a match a girl could command. There was a jointure settled on the bride, the property arrangement that would support her if she were widowed, and this too was negotiated closely, because it was the wife's only real financial security. Lawyers drew up the settlement. Fathers argued. The whole thing was a property transaction with a wedding attached, and the wedding, though genuinely religious and genuinely felt, was the ceremonial seal on a deal. The ages could be young. The law permitted marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, and while most of the gentry married rather later than that in practice, betrothals could be arranged in childhood, and marriages could certainly be made in the mid-teens, where an estate was at stake. And it was quite possible, particularly at the highest levels, for a bride and groom to be barely acquainted, to have met only a handful of times under supervision, or in some cases, hardly at all, before the wedding day. Consent was, technically, required. The Church held that a marriage needed the free consent of both parties, and this was not a dead letter, and there are cases of young people refusing matches and of marriages being challenged on grounds of coercion. But consider the practical position of a 15-year-old girl whose father, whose entire family, whose whole future prospects all point one way, and who has been raised from birth to understand that this is how marriages are made, and that her duty is to accept a suitable one. The formal freedom to refuse is real. The actual freedom to refuse is thin, and everyone knew it. What did you get, then, out of this arrangement? Beyond a husband you did not choose. You got position. Marriage was, for a woman of your class, the event that determined the entire shape of her adult life. The house she would live in, the rank she would hold, the authority she would exercise, the children she would bear. A good marriage was a career, and running a great household was the profession it led to. The competence we have watched all day is the competence of a woman who was trained from girlhood for exactly this, and who arrived in it through a door that other people opened. And many such marriages, made coldly on paper, became genuinely warm in practice. People who spend 30 years running an enterprise together and burying children together tend to arrive somewhere, and the surviving letters between Tudor husbands and wives are often affectionate, teasing, worried, tender. Affection was not the basis of the match. It was frequently the result. And if the marriage was bad, you had very little recourse. Divorce, as we understand it, did not exist. Annulment was possible on narrow grounds, and was largely the preserve of the powerful and well-lawyered, as the king's own famously complicated marital history was demonstrating to the entire country. Separation was possible in extremity, but socially costly and financially precarious. A woman in a miserable marriage was, in the main, in it, and her family might or might not intervene, and the law would be little help. That is the hard flaw beneath all the competence and authority we have been admiring. Everything you have depends on a relationship you did not choose and cannot leave, which returns us, one last time, to widowhood and to the strange bargain at the center of a Tudor gentlewoman's life. As a wife you have power without standing. As a widow you would have standing at last, your legal personhood restored, your jointure your own, your household genuinely yours, free to remarry or not as you chose. Many wealthy widows chose not to. Having spent their married lives exercising real authority on borrowed license, they found the prospect of holding it in their own right, answerable to nobody, worth more than another husband. You can hardly blame them. It was, for many women of this century, the first and only time they were legally themselves. Dinner is at 11 in the morning, And if that seems startling, it is worth remembering that you have been awake since first light and at work for hours, and that the day is organized around daylight because daylight is the only free light there is. Supper will come in the late afternoon or early evening, and after dark, in a house lit only by candles and firelight, the day winds down quickly, because there is a limit to what can be done by flame. Dinner in a Tudor great house is not a private family meal. It is the household's central daily ceremony, and it happens in the great hall, and the whole family, in that broad Tudor sense, assembles for it. 60 people sit down to eat, in a single room, in a strictly determined order, and that order is the whole point. The hall is arranged as a diagram of the social world. At one end, raised on a dais, stands the high table, and there sit the family and the most honored guests, elevated literally above everyone else, visible to the entire room. Below the dais, running down the length of the hall, are the other tables, and everyone in the household has a place at them, and their place is precisely calibrated to their standing. The senior officers sit nearest the high table, below them the yeomen, below them the grooms, below them the lowest of the household. Where a person sits announces exactly what they are worth, and everyone in the room can read it at a glance, every day, twice a day. And the food matches the seating. This is the detail that startles people most, and it is quite real. The quality of what was served descended along with the tables. The high table received the finest dishes, the best meats, the spiced and elaborate preparations, the white bread made from finely bolted flour. Further down the hall, the fare grew plainer, the bread coarser and darker, the meat commoner, the number of dishes fewer. It was not that the lower servants were starved, far from it. They were fed substantially, and it was a real part of their compensation. But they were fed differently, and visibly so, in the same room at the same time. The hierarchy was not a matter of theory. It was on the plate, and you could see it from where you sat. There was ceremony in the serving, too, and considerable ritual. Dishes were carried in procession. The washing of hands before eating was a formal act. Water poured over the hands from a ewer into a basin, because most eating was done with fingers and a knife, the fork being an exotic Italian curiosity, not yet in general English use. There was a strict etiquette of carving, of who was served first and in what order, of how the salt was placed and who sat above it and who below, which gave us a phrase that survives in the language still. Serving at table was not menial work in this world. It was an honor, performed by young gentlemen of good family, part of that same education by placement we spoke of, and a boy learned to carve and serve as part of becoming a gentleman. Now, what is actually on the table? Meat, in enormous variety and quantity, is the short answer, because a great household ate meat at a level that would astonish us. Beef, mutton, veal, pork, and beyond the domestic animals, a whole range of birds and game that we have largely stopped eating altogether, capons and geese and pigeons, and at grander tables, swan and heron and other creatures now unthinkable. Fish on the days when the church required it, and those days were numerous, Fridays and Saturdays and the whole of Lent, and a household of this size had to plan seriously around fish days, keeping fish ponds and buying in salt fish and stockfish by the barrel. Bread in quantity, graded by fineness, ale, brewed on the premises, drunk by everyone including children, in quantities that sound alarming until you remember that it was weak, that it was nourishing, and that it was safer than most available water. Wine at the high table for those of rank. And what is largely missing? Vegetables, at least in the way we would expect. They existed and were eaten, but they carried low status, associated with the food of the poor, and they did not feature at the high table with anything like the prominence they have for us. Sugar, by contrast, was luxurious and prized, and a wealthy Tudor table displayed it proudly in elaborate sweet confections, sometimes sculpted into astonishing decorative shapes. And there is no potato, no tomato, no chocolate, no tea, no coffee, no tobacco in general use, no turkey yet on the ordinary English table. The whole grammar of English food that we take for granted is still, in 1545, mostly in the future. Behind all of this stands the provisioning, and the provisioning is your department. Feeding 60 people twice a day, every day, and feeding them according to their rank, and meeting the fish days, and being ready for guests who might arrive with their own retinues at short notice, is a logistical operation requiring genuine planning. Much of it comes from the estate itself, the home farm, and the fish ponds and the dovecote, and the orchards and the brew house and the bakehouse, because a great house aimed to feed itself as far as it could. The rest must be bought, and bought shrewdly, and stored, and guarded, and accounted for. There are stores to be kept in the face of a whole year's cycle, salting and preserving against the winter, planning the consumption of what will not keep. A misjudgment here means a household short of food in February, which is not an inconvenience, but a crisis. One more thing about the fish days, because they are more interesting than they sound, and they had just become politically complicated. The old religious requirement to abstain from meat on certain days was a matter of faith, and with the upheavals of recent years, its standing had become uncertain. But the state had a strong secular interest in keeping the fish days regardless, and said so quite openly, because a country that eats fish maintains a fishing fleet, and a fishing fleet maintains sailors and ships are what a naval power runs on. So fish days were argued for on grounds of national defense as much as devotion, which is a wonderfully Tudor combination of the pious and the practical. What it meant for you, in the kitchen accounts, was that the fish days were staying whatever happened to the theology, and your provisioning had to reflect that. So dinner, which looks from the outside like a lord and lady dining in splendor, is in fact the visible top of an operation you have spent your morning managing. You sit at the high table and eat your fine dishes, and the room below you eats its plainer ones, and the whole thing runs because the woman on the dais planned it, ordered it, provisioned it, and will account for it. The ceremony is your work, dressed as your privilege. There is one duty of a great house that could descend without warning and transform an ordinary week into a crisis, and it is hospitality. A Tudor great house was expected to receive, and receiving was not a pleasure but an obligation, and the obligation fell on you. Understand what a guest meant in this world. A person of standing did not travel alone. He traveled with his retinue, his servants and horses and gentlemen, and when he came to stay, they all came to stay. A visitor of consequence might arrive with 12 people, or 30, or in extreme cases very many more, and every one of them had to be housed, fed, and their horses stabled and fed as well, for as long as the visit lasted. A substantial visit could increase the population of your household by half overnight, and it was expected that you would absorb this graciously and without any sign of strain. The notice you received might be short, roads were slow, and communication uncertain, and while a formal visit would be arranged in advance, plans shifted, and travelers arrived early or late or unannounced. There is a particular kind of Tudor domestic emergency that consists of word arriving that a great personage and his people will be with you by evening, and the whole household turning at once to the making of beds, the killing of poultry, the sending out for supplies, the airing of chambers, and the rapid rethinking of a week's provisioning. And it fell to you to orchestrate all of it at speed, while appearing entirely unruffled, because the visible ease of a great house's hospitality was precisely the point of it. At the extreme end of this stood the royal progress, which was the terror and the glory of the greatest houses. The monarch travelled the country in summer with an enormous court, and stayed at the houses of the nobility along the way, and to be honoured with a royal visit was a mark of extraordinary favour and could ruin you. The household of hundreds had to be fed and lodged. The house had to be improved and furnished to a standard fit for the sovereign. Entertainments had to be devised. Gifts had to be given. Families spent fortunes preparing for royal visits, and some spent more than they could afford, and a few were quietly beggared by the honour. Elizabeth, later in the century, would raise this to an art form, but the practice was already well established in your day. Below that terrifying summit, ordinary hospitality was constant. Kin came and stayed for weeks. Neighbours came for days. Men of business came. Travellers of respectable standing might claim a night's lodging on the strength of a connection. The great house was, among its other functions, the inn of its district for people of the right class, and its reputation depended on how it performed that role. A house known for good hospitality gained honour, allies, and influence. A house known for meanness lost all three. So the expense, which was considerable, was understood as an investment in the family's standing, and cutting it was not a saving, but a self-inflicted wound. And the household did not only receive travellers, it travelled itself. A family of standing owning several properties would move between them through the year, and the move was a substantial operation, because in this century, much of the furnishing moved with them. The valuable hangings came down and were packed. The beds, the plate, the linen, the chests were loaded onto carts. The household in large part travelled too. The house being left was closed up, and the house being opened had to be made ready. This is one reason so much Tudor furniture is built to be portable. Chests rather than fitted cupboards, beds that dismantle, hangings that unhook. The great house was semi-nomadic, and the logistics of moving it were, again, substantially your problem. Why move at all? Partly because a house that has held a large household for months becomes, frankly, unpleasant and needed emptying and cleaning in an age with no plumbing and limited means of dealing with the accumulated consequences of 60 people living somewhere. Partly to consume the produce of each estate on the spot, rather than transporting it. Partly to show the family's face on each of its properties, because a landlord who is never seen is a landlord whose tenants grow careless. And partly for business, the pull of London and the court, which drew the gentry up to town for the legal terms and the political season, and drove them back to the country afterwards. So your year has a rhythm of arrivals and departures, guests coming and the household going, and the calm domestic day we have been living is only the baseline from which the year's disruptions rise. Nothing about it is static, and every disruption, every visit, and every removal is an operation to be planned and provisioned and executed by the woman who runs the house, which is to say, by you, and its success will be attributed to the natural hospitality of the family, and its failure to your incompetence. The afternoon brings the business of the wider world, and it arrives, as it always did, on paper. Letters are the nervous system of a Tudor family, and the writing and receiving of them is one of the most consequential things you do. Understand first what a letter cost in effort. There is no post office. Letters travel by servant, by carrier, by any trustworthy person going in the right direction, and they may take days or weeks and may not arrive at all. This means a letter is never casual. It is a considered document, often carrying business of real weight, and it is written knowing it may be read by others along the way, so that discretion is built into the phrasing. Paper is expensive. Ink must be made or bought. The physical act of writing, with a cut quill on rough paper, is laborious, and so letters are dense, purposeful things, packed with matter, and the ability to write a good one is a genuine and valued skill. Your letters go out to your husband if he is away, reporting on the estate and the household and the children and the neighbors and the lawsuits, and asking his direction on matters that need it. They go to your kin, maintaining the web of family connection on which everything depends. They go to your children in their placed households, and to the parents of the children in yours. They go to men of business, to lawyers, to stewards of other properties. They go, when necessary, upward to people of greater standing, whose favor the family needs. And those letters are composed with immense care, because a badly judged approach to a patron could cost a family dearly. And this is where a Tudor noblewoman's real power becomes visible, because the letters that survive from women of this class are not domestic chatter. They are business correspondents, historians who work with the letter collections of Tudor and Elizabethan gentry families find wives writing about rents and arrears, about disputed boundaries and lawsuits in progress, about the buying and selling of livestock and the management of woodland, about the conduct of servants and the state of the harvest, about the maneuvering for offices and favors at court. They are the letters of people running things, and they were written by women whose legal capacity to run anything was, as we have seen, nil. Which brings us to the situation that defined so many of these women's lives, and that we should look at directly, because it is where their competence was most severely tested. Your husband is away. He is away often, and sometimes for a very long time. He may be at court, pursuing the family's interests where interests are pursued, which could keep him in London for months. He may be at law, and Tudor gentlemen were spectacularly litigious, spending years and fortunes on lawsuits over land. He may be serving in some royal office in another county. He may be at war, and in this particular decade, with the king campaigning in France and the Scottish border unquiet, that is a live possibility. And while he is gone, you are the estate, not symbolically. Actually, the rents must be collected, and you will see it done. The tenants bring their disputes and their requests, and you will hear them. The steward reports to you. Decisions about repairs, about timber, about stock, about the hiring and dismissing of men come to you. If a neighbor encroaches on your boundary, you must respond, and respond firmly, because weakness invites more. If a lawsuit is in progress, you must keep it moving, deal with the attorneys, gather what is needed. If money must be raised or debts paid, you arrange it. You are, in every practical sense, the head of the household and the manager of the estate, and everyone deals with you as such, and the family's fortunes for those months rest on how well you do it. There is a particular kind of authority in this that is hard to describe from outside. It is real, and everyone acknowledges it, and it is also entirely borrowed. You act by your husband's authority as his deputy, and the moment he returns, it reverts to him. You may have run the estate faultlessly for 8 months and made a dozen shrewd decisions, and when he comes home, you hand it all back and resume your place as his wife, and nothing you did during those months belongs to you or is recorded as yours. The account books will show his estate. The lawsuit will be in his name. The competence was yours, and the credit is his, and the arrangement is so thoroughly assumed by everyone, including you, that it would be strange to remark on it. And in the hardest cases, this deputy authority had to be exercised in genuine crisis. There are episodes in this century of gentle women holding houses against hostile neighbors or armed factions, negotiating with sheriffs, resisting attempts to seize property, and doing it alone with the men of the household behind them. It was not common, but it happened, and when it happened, the women concerned generally did it well, because they had spent their adult lives managing large operations and were not, whatever the law thought of them, novices at authority. So the afternoon's letters get written, in your own hand or dictated to a clerk, sealed with wax and your husband's seal or your own, and sent out into a slow and unreliable world, carrying the business of a family that runs, in large part, on the judgment of a woman who does not legally exist. And when the letters are done, the light is beginning to go, and the household turns toward supper and toward the evening, which in a Tudor house is its own particular country. The day we have been living is one day, and it is worth widening out for a while to see the year it sits inside, because a Tudor household lived by the seasons in a way that no modern household does, and your management ran on an annual cycle as much as a daily one. The year had 2 calendars laid over each other. There was the agricultural year, dictated by the land and the weather, and there was the church year, dictated by the great feasts and fasts, and between them they governed almost everything. Take the agricultural year first, because it determined what there was to eat. Spring brought the first fresh food after the long, lean months and the beginning of the growing season. Summer brought abundance, the fruit and the vegetables and the milk at its best, and the hay harvest, and then the grain harvest in late summer, which was the single most important event of the entire year, the weeks on which everything depended, when the whole countryside worked, and a wet fortnight could mean hunger in February. Autumn brought the fruit and the nuts and the slaughtering, because animals that could not be kept through the winter were killed in late autumn, and their meat salted and smoked and preserved to last. And then winter, the long stretch of living off the stores, eating salt meat and preserved food, and whatever the dairy still gave, with the fresh things gone, and the lean months of late winter and early spring stretching ahead. That preserving season was one of the great annual operations of a household, and it was yours to direct. The salting of meat in quantity, the making of bacon, the pressing of cheese, the brewing, the laying down of fruit, the drying of herbs, all of it had to be done at the right moment, in the right quantity, and done properly, because a barrel of meat that spoiled was a serious loss, and a winter's provisioning that ran short was a genuine crisis. Getting the year's preserving right was among the most consequential judgments a housewife made, and the knowledge of how to do it was exactly the kind of knowledge passed from mother to daughter and written in the receipt books. Over that agricultural year lay the church year, and it was equally binding. The fast days, first of all, and there were a great many, Fridays, Saturdays in many observances, the 40 days of Lent, the vigils before major feasts. On these days no meat was to be eaten, and a household of 60 had to be fed something else, which meant fish, which meant a serious standing arrangement for fish, the the fish ponds on the estate, the barrels of salt fish and dried stockfish bought in and stored. Lent in particular was a 6-week logistical problem, repeating every spring, and it landed at exactly the moment when winter stores were at their lowest. And the feasts, which were the other pole, Christmas above all, and Christmas in a Tudor great house, was a serious festival lasting the full 12 days, with feasting and open hospitality and entertainments and gifts and a general relaxation of the ordinary order. Easter, after the long deprivation of Lent, was a great release. There were the saints' days and the quarter days and the local festivals and the harvest celebrations. These were the punctuation of the year, and they were also, in their way, part of the household's obligations, because a great house was expected to keep its feasts generously and to include its people and its neighborhood in them. The quarter days deserve a note because they were when money moved. Rents fell due on them, wages were paid, contracts began and ended, servants were hired and left. The whole financial rhythm of an estate ran on these 4 points in the year, and the collection of rents at the quarter days was a serious business, requiring organization and, sometimes, firmness with tenants in arrears. If your husband was away at a quarter day, the collecting was yours. So your management was seasonal as well as daily. In one part of the year, you were driving the preserving and provisioning against the coming winter. In another, you were dealing with harvest and its labor. In another, you were feeding the household through Lent. In another, you were mounting the Christmas hospitality. And underneath it all, you were watching the stores, calculating how far they would stretch, deciding what could be spent and what must be held back, running the household's food security in an economy where there was no supermarket, no reliable way to buy your way out of a shortfall, and where a mistake in September could mean hunger in March. That is a kind of expertise, and it was held almost entirely by women, and it was learned by doing and passed on by teaching, and it never appeared in any account of what the great families of England were doing with their time. The men were at court, and at law, and at war, and their doings are in the records. The women were making sure everybody ate, all year, every year, and that is in the records too if you know where to look, in the receipt books and the household accounts and the letters. But nobody thought to call it history for a very long time. The light is going, and the household draws inward toward the evening, and here we come to the occupation that every account of a Tudor woman mentions and almost every modern reader underestimates. You take up your needle. Needlework was the universal female labor of this age at every social level, and its universality is the thing to grasp. Poor women spun. Women of the middling sort sewed the plain necessities of their households, and women of your rank sewed too, endlessly, and were expected to. It was not a hobby. The household's linen, the shirts and smocks and sheets and napkins, was largely made at home by the women of the household, because ready-made clothing in our sense did not exist, and only the very wealthiest could pay professionals for everything, and even they had the basic linens made in the house. Somebody had to make all of it, and that somebody was female. There is a well-known story that captures how far up the social scale this went. Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess and Queen of England, made her husband's shirts with her own hands and continued to do so even as his affections turned elsewhere, to the considerable annoyance of the woman they had turned to. A queen sewing shirts. That is not a story about her humility. It is a story about what wives did, all wives, including royal ones, because the making of a husband's linen was a wife's proper work and a mark of her care. Beyond the plain necessary sewing, there was the other kind, the decorative embroidery, that was one of the great arts of this century, and at which English women excelled. Blackwork, colored silks, gold and silver thread, the elaborate ornamentation of clothing, and cushions and hangings, and altar cloths. This work is genuinely beautiful and technically formidable, and museums are full of it, and much of it was made by gentlewomen at exactly the kind of evening we are sitting in now. It represented enormous quantities of skilled hours. A single embroidered forepart or a set of cushion covers could absorb months of a woman's evenings, and it was, again, filed under accomplishment rather than art, done by women whose names were rarely attached to the finished work, so that we admire the objects today in cases with no idea who made them. And crucially, sewing was social. This is not a solitary occupation. You sit with your gentlewomen in the warmest room of the house with the candles lit, and you sew together, and while you sew, you talk. News, family business, the affairs of the county, gossip, plans. Someone reads aloud, which was a common accompaniment, because reading aloud let the whole group share a book, while their hands stayed busy. Someone plays and sings, because music was expected of the accomplished, and instruments were common in a house like this. There may be cards or chess or tables, the games of the period. The evening in a Tudor great house is a companionable, occupied, quietly industrious thing, hands moving, voices going, the day's work not quite over, but softened into something more agreeable. Let us think about what those hands are doing across a lifetime, though, because the arithmetic is worth pausing on. If you sew for 2 or 3 hours most evenings from girlhood into old age, that is a very large number of hours indeed, tens of thousands of them, poured into linen and silk. It is one of the largest single expenditures of time in a woman's life, comparable to a career, and it produced real, useful, valuable goods that the household would otherwise have had to buy. The economic contribution of all that female needlework across all the households of England was enormous and almost entirely uncounted, because it happened inside homes and generated no wages and appeared in no accounts. It is the same pattern we keep finding tonight in the still room and the counting house and the letter book. Real productive work performed by women, made invisible by the fact that it happened domestically. The reading aloud deserves a moment of its own, because it was the ordinary way books were consumed in this century, and it changes what reading meant. A book was expensive. Print had been in England for less than a lifetime, and while it had brought prices down enormously from the manuscript age, a book was still a considerable object, and a household might own a modest shelf of them rather than a library. So a book was shared, and sharing meant reading aloud, one person voicing it for the room, while the rest sewed or listened. Reading was social and audible rather than silent and solitary, and a good reader was valued for it. What was read? Devotional works above all, the Psalms and the primers and the sermons, histories and chronicles, poetry, practical books, herbals and receipts and husbandry manuals, which were consulted rather than read straight through. And increasingly, as the century went on, the new printed literature that was pouring off the presses and reaching further down the social scale than writing had ever reached before. You are living, without particularly noticing it, in the first century of printed books, and the difference it is making to the texture of ordinary intellectual life is enormous. Supper has been and gone by now, lighter than dinner, taken in the late afternoon or early evening. The great hall has emptied of its 60 diners. The household has withdrawn into its evening. The the servants to their own quarters and pastimes, the family to the warm chambers above, and you sit with your women and your needle in the candlelight, and the fire burns, and the dark presses on the windows. Consider the dark, actually, because it shaped these evenings absolutely. There is no light in this house but flame, candles, which cost money and are used with awareness of that cost, wax for the family, and tallow for the household, tallow being cheaper and smellier and smokier. Rushlights, cheaper still. Firelight, that is all. The quality of light is dim and orange and unsteady, and it pools rather than fills, so that people gather close to it, and the corners of every room stay dark. Fine needlework by candlelight is genuinely hard on the eyes, and everyone doing it knew that. Reading is a strain, and so the evening naturally contracts around the fire and the candles, a small bright island in a large dark house, and when the fire dies and the candles gutter, there is nothing to do but go to bed, which is why Tudor people went to bed early and rose early and organized their whole day around the sun. The talk grows quieter, the needles slow, someone puts down the book, and the household begins the long process of shutting itself down for the night, which in a house this size is its own considerable operation. The evening ends earlier than yours does. The candles are burning down, and the fire has settled to a red heart, and the house is beginning its nightly shutting. There are last prayers. The household gathers, or the family and their immediate people do, and the day closes as it opened, on the knees, with the words that have closed every day of your life. There is a symmetry to it that must have been deeply steadying. The same frame around every day, the same words at the beginning and the end, whatever happened in between. Then the house is secured. The doors are shut and barred, and this matters in a way it does not for us, because a great house standing alone in the country holds a great deal of value, and there is no police force, no organized protection beyond what the household provides itself. The plate is put away and locked. The valuables are secured. Someone has charge of the keys, and the keys are a real emblem of trust and authority, and in many houses they end the night with the mistress or with her most trusted officer. The fires are damped or banked so that they can be revived in the morning rather than laid cold from nothing, and a fire left unbanked in a house full of timber and hangings is a danger everyone respects, because a house fire in this age is a catastrophe with no remedy. There is a last round of the house, too, in a well-run establishment. Someone walks it, checking that the fires are safe, that the doors are fast, that no candle has been left burning where it should not be. In some households, this was a formal duty with a formal name, and it was taken seriously, because the dangers of the night in a Tudor house were real and specific. Fire above all, but also the simple fact of a large, valuable house standing in the dark countryside, and the prudence of knowing that everything was shut and everyone was accounted for. And there is the question of who sleeps where, which was not a matter of preference, but of rank and function, and which had to be arranged and rearranged constantly as the household's population shifted with guests and departures. The household goes to its beds, and its beds are various. The senior people have proper chambers. Others sleep in shared rooms, on pallets, in the hall in the older fashion, wherever their station puts them. Attendants may sleep near their masters, on truckle beds pushed under the great bed by day and pulled out at night. 60 people are distributed through a house that has no corridors in our sense, where rooms open into other rooms, and privacy remains, to the end of the day, an aspiration rather than a fact. You go up to your own chamber, attended, and the long dressing of the morning is reversed, layer by layer, pins drawn, laces loosened, the headdress lifted, the heavy gown taken away and put by. Your hair is brushed and braided for the night. A cap goes on, because heads are covered even in bed, and you climb into the great curtained bed, and the curtains are pulled close around you, and the small, warm world inside them closes over. Lie there a moment before sleep. The house around you is dark and quiet, and full of sleeping people. The fires are banked, the doors are barred, the stores are counted, and the accounts are square, and the sick have had their medicines, and the letters have gone out, and the children's lessons are set, and tomorrow the whole thing will need doing again. You have run a community of 60 souls through another day, competently, invisibly, and without anyone thinking it remarkable, because a well-run house is one where nothing appears to require running. And in the morning, it will begin again, in the cold and the dark, with the curtains drawn back and the first grey light, and the whole slow, immense machine of the household turning over once more under your hands. Let it go quiet now. Let the fires sink. Let the house sleep. Before we let the whole of it go, let us hold this day up one last time and look at it honestly, because there are two truths in it, and they do not resolve into each other. The competence was real. That is the first, and it deserves to be said plainly, because 500 years of portraiture have taught us to see these women as decorative and still. The woman whose day we have just lived managed an institution of 60 people. She ran its finances, its supply, its staff, and its stores. She practiced medicine on her whole household with skills she had spent a lifetime accumulating, and kept a manuscript pharmacopoeia she had built herself. She educated her own children and other people's, and trained the next generation of women who would run houses like hers. She wrote the letters that carried her family's business through the world. She managed a preserving and provisioning cycle that stood between 60 people and hunger. And when her husband was away, which was often, she simply became the estate, collecting its rents, defending its boundaries, pursuing its lawsuits, and answering for all of it. This was skilled, complex, consequential work, performed under real pressure, and she was good at it, and so were hundreds of women like her across Tudor England. And the structure was real too, and it took every bit of that from her at the level of the record. She did all of it as a legal non-person. She could not own what she managed, or sign for what she spent, or sue in her own name for the estate she was defending. The house was his house, the estate his estate, the accounts his accounts, and her name appears in them, where it appears at all, as his wife. She acted always by delegated authority, which could be withdrawn, and which reverted the moment he came home. Her medicine was housewifery, rather than physic, because a man doing it for money was a practitioner, and a woman doing it for 60 people was simply a good wife. Her needle produced tens of thousands of hours of valuable goods that appeared in no ledger. Her whole vast working life was categorized as domestic, and domestic meant invisible, and invisible meant that when the historians came to write about the 16th century, they wrote about the men at court, and the men at war, and the men at law, and the enormous competent machinery humming away in every great house in England went unrecorded for 400 years. Both of those are true, at once, and the temptation is to let one dissolve the other. To say that she was really powerful, so the legal disability did not matter much, or to say that she was legally nothing, so the power was illusory. Neither is honest. She held genuine authority and no standing whatsoever, and she lived inside that contradiction every day without, so far as we can tell, finding it unbearable, because it was simply the shape of the world she had been born into, and there was no other shape on offer. The women of this century were not waiting to be rescued from their situation. They were getting on with running things inside it, extremely well, and building, in the receipt books and the letter collections and the account rolls, the evidence that would eventually let us see what they had actually been doing. That is why a day like this one is worth spending 2 hours inside, not to be indignant on her behalf, which she would probably have found impertinent, and not to admire her as though she were exceptional, which she was not, but to correct the picture, to replace the still figure in the stiff gown with the woman who ran the place. The portrait shows her standing motionless in her best clothes, because that is the only thing a portrait can show. The day shows her working. So let her have her day, and let it be seen for what it was, and let the house go quiet now. The fires banked, the doors barred, the household asleep in its ranked and crowded rooms, and the woman who runs all of it lying behind her drawn curtains in the dark, resting, before the whole thing begins again at first light. Sleep well.